Zelenskyy addresses Congress, climate change and banking, and daylight savings time. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is a Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are libertarian Kat Murti of Feminists for Liberty. Kat, great to see you.
Nice seeing you again. Thanks for having me on.
Conservative independent journalist Peter Pischke. Peter, great to have you.
Howdy, howdy.
And progressive political reporter James Rosen. James, wonderful to see you.
Good to be here again.
Welcome, everyone. This week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed the U.S. Congress on his country's war with Russia. Here's a story from ABC News.
With his nation under relentless fire from Russia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy making an impassioned plea to the U.S. for more help.
I'm addressing the President Biden. You are the leader of the nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace.
In a rare virtual address to Congress, Zelenskyy pleading with the U.S. to put in place a no-fly zone over Ukraine. President Biden is all but certain to once again reject that request, fearing it could bring U.S. troops into a direct fight with the Russian military. Instead, Biden is expected to detail how the U.S. will provide $800 million in new military aid to Ukraine, including anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles.
James, what do you think the impact will be of Zelenskyy's address to Congress?
I think we're already seeing, even before his address, we saw an astoundingly huge aid bill to Ukraine, $13.6 billion. I still can't wrap my head around that. And then President Biden yesterday signed an order giving $800 million in military weapons to Ukraine, some of which we have refused to give before, most notably in 2014. But the United States, I think, will still not do what he wants, which is help enforce a NATO-enforced no-fly zone over Ukraine. That would almost certainly put us in direct conflict with Russian pilots, and at least for the foreseeable future, that's a path we're not willing to go down. But it certainly buttressed his support among members of both parties in Congress.
Kat, what about you? What do you think the impact of Zelenskyy's speech to Congress will be?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that Zelensky's address received such a ovation, such a response from Congress. It was very moving. The video that they showed at the end was truly disturbing. The pictures of war, the images of war, and all of the children involved. You know, as a mother myself, that was truly upsetting to watch all of these babies in war zones with the bombing. And I think that it really touched on heartstrings. And if anything, it showed us how horrible war is. I feel for the Ukrainian people. They're in a very bad situation. All of that is true. That said, unfortunately, I do think that enforcing a no-fly zone would make more war, not less. What the U.S. should be doing, and what it is currently not doing, is opening the pathways for refugees to more easily escape these war zones and come to the United States. And when I say that, I mean not just Ukrainian refugees, but also Russian refugees of both war and the oppressive authoritarian government under Putin.
Peter, what about you? What do you think the impact of Zelensky's speech to Congress will be?
Well, I found this speech incredibly moving. I think the combination of how they handled the media and prepared that video with the footage of especially the children that have been harmed or killed, that was extraordinarily impactful. As someone that's into media production and looks at stuff critically, I was very impressed. His team did an amazing job. That being said, what's its effect? Well, there have been some polls by Pew and others that have come out today that show that Americans, the people themselves, haven't really moved very much on the no-fly zone concept. And while there are people who don't really understand it, and there are some people who understand what it means and advocate for it, generally the Americans don't want to go there. Now, where his speech, I think, had an impact is you can definitely feel in our leadership, especially in the media and in places like Congress, that there are people who are opening up to these ideas, who are opening up to measures that will go near this line but not quite cross over it. The only problem being is we don't quite get to determine if Putin and Russia and the rest of the world thinks that's crossing a line or not. Ideas where he says, okay, if you're not going to use NATO, well, then let's put alliances kind of like NATO. Or if you're not going to, give us the weapons, give us something that are kind of like weapons, instead of some drones that have extensive capabilities. And so there is a bit of a rhetorical game going on in all this. But I mean, if I was in Zelensky's position, I'd do the exact same thing. I think the man is a bit of a hero for doing it. And the U.S. still hasn't decided if it wants to get more involved in this or not, or if we're going to let it play out, or if we're going to let NATO deal with it. So far, we've made a lot of good decisions, but we're still kind of in murky territory and not fully committed to one course to take or not.
James, what do you think about Biden's response?
Well, I think President Biden's an emotional guy. He sometimes wears his feelings on his sleeve. And, I think he was moved, as were almost all members of Congress. How much, both President Obama and President Trump greatly expanded the use of executive orders by presidents, and did all sorts of things when Congress refused to act. So far, President Biden has not followed suit, and he's only been in office 14 months, and I think has not issued nearly as many executive orders. We'll see if he turns to executive orders to do more than he already has done. But as the other speakers have said, we're sending huge amounts of money. We're sending increasingly powerful military equipment that we did not want to send just a few months ago. I'm not sure what more President Biden can do concretely than he's doing now. In my opinion, he's done a very good job of unifying the European Union and NATO, much of it behind the scenes. Unlike some previous presidents, he doesn't care about taking credit. In fact, he seems to not want to take credit in order to get more unity among the Europeans. So he's doing a lot. But we're getting to the point where the next steps would be much more direct involvement. And unless the one thing I would note is that a Russian bomb reportedly, I think a couple days ago, fell quite close to a Polish town. It was basically on the border with Poland, on the western border. And obviously, if there was more of a misfire and a bomb hit a Polish town or the territory of another NATO country, all bets are off. Then the equation changes dramatically. And I wouldn't rule that out. These are not, I don't believe these are smart bombs that can hone in exactly on the right side. So we'll see.
Kat, do you think Biden is doing enough?
I think it's difficult to measure what enough looks like in these situations. War is a bad situation. This is not something easy that we can just solve with the snap of a finger or signing an executive order. The reason that people support policies such as no-fly zones is because it sounds as if it's an easy way for us to go in there and stop everything bad from happening without actually going to war. And that's just not the way that it works. The options on the board here are essentially escalating or de-escalating the war, and more options than not point towards escalation. That's very concerning. What we should be doing is, again, remembering that the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, they are people. These are governments at war, and people are in the crossfire. This is something that happens all around the world, and we need to really help refugees, both in this crisis and elsewhere. We need to, Russians here in the United States have been reporting that they're being discriminated against, targeted against by people who are upset by what's happening in Ukraine. And of course, these people are not the people who are murdering people in Ukraine. That's not what's happening. So please remember that people are not their governments, and to the extent that we can support people peacefully towards freedom, that's what we need to do. I do worry as well. There's reports that Russians don't believe the extent to which this has happened, and what Russia is doing within Ukraine. And I worry that as companies like Instagram are pulling out of Russia, are blocking Russian users from accessing news from around the world. And I know it's weird to think about things like Instagram as news, but think about how on every single social media platform, we've seen support for Ukraine trending, right? And as social media companies are pulling out of Russia, as Russians, the Russian people are being cut off from more and more nations. I don't think that that's actually moving us closer to peace. I think that's moving us towards a situation where it's easier for them to be controlled by their government, to be fed a false narrative, and for them to build resentment, to feel as if what they're doing is more just. So a lot of these measures that might seem like easy measures that we can take can actually make the situation a lot worse.
And Peter, what about you? Do you feel that Biden is doing enough and acting strongly enough?
To be fair to Biden, who was not elected to be a president in this situation, I don't think Americans thought of him as someone that have to deal with these, but that seems to be what he's going to have to deal with during his tenure. Has he been doing enough? Unfortunately, no, at least to the point where he doesn't want to go into a direct war. There are some actions he could have taken and steps that he should have avoided. Here are just several. For one, he's stepped in the way of NATO and places like Poland from working independently to assist Ukraine with arms and something like the MiGs. We found out that was not the Pentagon, not the Defense Department, Biden himself that put a halt to it. We originally had said Poland and the other countries that might be interested in sending old Soviet era military tech over to Ukraine, which Ukraine is fine with because that's what they know how to use. But we stepped in the way of that. Other parts that Biden has mishandled, the messaging has been extremely mixed. At times, he said the things out loud you're never supposed to say, saying, we will not go into World War III. You know, when he's saying over and over again that he's scared that for us to become more defensive, more officially enter it, I understand that's what he believes, and that's probably what he should think as a president, but you just don't say that out loud. It just puts a bad stance, and it's just a bad negotiation technique. And the last is, he is unfortunately, for whatever reason, unable to kill the projects he was working with on Russia elsewhere. We found out after he had been pushing hard to get Russian oil out of Europe and other places, but he wanted to work with Russia to help convince places like Iran to agree to something that kind of like the Obama-Iran deal, but the focus on being here oil and energy. Which is crazy, because if you're working with this guy and he knows this guy is crazy and he's trying to establish in the world order, this is a serious threat. We take this very seriously. We've got to be right for anything. And then you're asking him for help. It doesn't make much sense.
Also this week, one of President Biden's nominees for the Federal Reserve Board withdrew her name due to a dispute over climate change. Here's MSNBC's coverage.
The White House had thought that this would be an easy win for them, but ultimately she faced such intense opposition from Senate Republicans over a range of issues, but lately, and most specifically, about her stance on climate change. The New Yorker had a copy of her resignation letter in which she was unapologetic about believing that climate change presents a risk to our economy and a risk to financial stability and should be something that the Fed takes into consideration. But Senator Joe Manchin, that Democrat from West Virginia, said that was just a straw too far for him, and he could not support her nomination because of the way that she views energy and because he is so concerned about inflation right now. After he came out opposing her, it became clear very quickly that there would not be any Republicans who would take his place to back her, and so she would not have the votes to get confirmed.
Kat, let's go first to you. Were you surprised that this nominee withdrew?
Look, I sympathize with her goals. I sympathize with the fact that she's concerned about the state of our environment and climate change, the potential negative impacts of climate change. However, the views that she held, the things that she wanted to do, not only went outside the scope of the Federal Reserve, in many ways they potentially, went against the Federal Reserve's mandate. Even to a clearer point as well, as the thing with climate change is that a lot of these top-down government-controlled measures have not been that effective, at least not in ways that we can measure, while at the same time, they've had a clear negative economic impact. Whereas what we have seen is that as countries gain wealth, as individuals gain wealth, they care about things like the environment more, and they start to do more things that have actually had real tangible benefits for our environment. So if the Federal Reserve sticks to its mandate, if it does make sure that we have a stable economy, if it makes sure we have access to jobs, things like that, I think we're a lot more likely to accomplish the types of things that she wants to do.
Peter, what do you think? Were you surprised that Raskin withdrew?
I don't know if surprise is the right word. If this had been a year ago or even last summer, we had gotten in some controversial Biden people into places of authority like Manning at BLM, I think they could have pulled off. There was at least something kind of like a Biden honeymoon, and the mansion wasn't as a solid a block, and they had it was just easier to get people through. Now, because of the economy and everything that's happened, with the Fed saying things like they want to get involved in helping determine ESG scores and helping use the power of the Fed to focus on things like climate change, and with everything else going on, it was just too much to ask for people, and it gave the Republicans and just a few Democrats enough of a spine to be able to push back. And from what I'm reading, people weren't super happy with, people who are in favor of a person like her, they just weren't very impassioned about her. And so there just wasn't enough push on the other direction. Am I glad she's not there? Kind of, sort of. The problem is there's probably going to be someone very similar that's going to fill her seat. And the Fed already kind of has plans to do a lot of the things she wanted to do. Some people are saying this is a big win. I just think it's a temporary setback, honestly, for what the Biden administration is hoping to do here.
James, what about you? Do you think that Raskin's withdrawal is a temporary setback for Biden?
Well, I just think it's unfortunate and really unfathomable that a lot of mainly Republican members of Congress, except those from Florida and California and some of the eastern seaboard states, a lot of them are not concerned about climate change. With due respect to my friend Kat, the notion that we can combat climate change through voluntarily individual action and that top-down, as she said, top-down government-led policies are not needed is, I think it's pretty fanciful. We are well past the point where voluntary individual actions can make much of a dent in climate change. This is a global crisis, and I applaud the Federal Reserve. To be honest, I don't really understand it to the end, but if the Federal Reserve wants to get, which is a very incredibly powerful agency, wants to get more involved in fighting climate change, I'm all for it.
Kat, do you want to respond to that? Do you think the Federal Reserve
Yes.
has a role in combating climate change?
Well, I'd like to respond to what my friend James just said. When I'm talking about free market responses to climate change, I'm not just talking about individual actions, which I do think are important. But what's beautiful about the free market is that those individual actions, they aggregate en masse. And so when we're talking about things like market signals, which is what I'm really talking about, when people become more wealthy, they value things like the environment more. And when they value things like the environment more, they invest in things like the environment more. They care about the more green options. They care about a company's carbon footprint. They care about those things, and they send signals that actually do make those changes en masse. So even though it might be individuals changing their minds about things, because they grow more wealthy and are able to care about things like the environment more, the actual impact is not an individual impact, it's a massive aggregate impact. And so I think that I wanted to clarify in that, but to what Peter was saying, yeah, I don't think it's at all surprising that at a time when Americans are particularly upset about the price at the pumps, a Federal Reserve nominee who's coming in saying that she was going to be pushing back against oil and gas companies and making them pay for climate change ended up being not as politically viable as some people would have liked.
Let me just quickly say that it was Republican President Richard Nixon who pushed for the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the legislation creating it into law, I think in 1972. And the EPA was established, bipartisan support, because the big companies, there were no signals about cleaning the air, cleaning the water. The big companies, unchecked, had made the air over Los Angeles and some other cities unbreathable, and the smog, you could barely see this Los Angeles skyline. I was there. So no, the companies on their own were not doing anything. And EPA has enforced the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, to force them to do something. So again, it was a Republican President, Richard Nixon, who pushed for the formation of the EPA because the big companies weren't doing anything.
Well, James, first off, I am not a Republican, so I do want to clarify that. Again, the companies have also look at the massive interest in green energy options, look at the massive interest in things like zero waste, look at what the Zoomers are demanding from companies. They want ethical companies. As they increasingly form the market share, companies' bottom lines are going to be tied to protecting the environment. And we're already seeing those changes happening. We're already seeing the way the companies are trying to market themselves, are competing to be greener, leaner companies. And, I think that we cannot undervalue that.
Peter, before we move on, I just want to give you a chance to weigh in.
Thank you. I was getting all excited. I was like, are they gonna let me talk? They're gonna let me talk? Okay. I think obviously Republicans leaders at the moment probably don't put climate change as a very high priority, at least for the solutions are often proposed. The EPA in many ways was helpful. So was the culture change, just the feeling that they should take on pollution, they should treat their better, people should pick up after themselves. A lot of things changed that were very good, but those changes were made by people who felt that they had a clear connection to their leaders and that they had agency in these decisions being made. This is your community. This is your state. These are your leaders. You voted for them. You can work on this. The problem is with Fed and so many of these other ideas is they want to do a runaround against the voters and they want to use undemocratic means. They want to use agencies like the Fed or the CDC. These are agencies that have clear mandates to do specific functions. They were not meant to be the thing that handles everything. Not that climate change isn't important, but the Fed's job is to watch the money supply. And if you guys haven't been paying attention, economy's not doing so hot right now. And right now they're trying to slowly raise the rate of interest to try to get caught up with inflation that's beginning to get out of control and could get much worse. Thanks. Okay. Thanks for letting me save my.
Well, we're going to move on to something a little bit lighter. Finally, this week, the U.S. Senate moved to make spring forward, fall back a thing of the past. Here's a story from CBS News.
Without warning and without objection, the Senate passed the Sunshine Protection Act, which makes daylight saving permanent, keeps it in place for good. Now it's on to the U.S. House, where the chairman of the powerful House Energy Committee tells CBS News, quote, "I'm pleased to see momentum building on the impacts of springing forward and falling back. It's clear to me that it's time to stop changing our clocks twice a year." Despite the bipartisanship, though, there's no vote on the calendar and no commitment from House leadership to do so. But here in Congress last week, medical experts testified before the U.S. House that during the twice-a-year clock changing, the rates of heart attack, stroke, and sleep disorder all rise. If this becomes law, it takes effect in November 2023, which gives time to adjust to the stopping of the adjusting of clocks.
Peter, I'll go to you first on this one. Do you have some strong feelings about daylight savings time?
I do. I have very strong feelings. Kill it with fire. Kill it, gather the ashes, burn them again. Never, never let this happen ever, ever again, ever. No, I hate daylight savings time. I really do. Probably because I've always been a night owl, but it's a ridiculous premise. I've always kind of wondered why this was, and I'd asked my grandparents who were Iowa farmers, and they're like, growing up, we were always told that this was an issue because we had to do it for the farmers. This is what they were told in Iowa, because we needed this extra hour of daylight so that they could get their chores done. And it turns out, now people are looking at the project again some more. Marco Rubio is leading this in the Senate. And it turns out none of really those common beliefs we had were true. Benjamin Franklin, yeah, he kind of had this idea, and so did a lot of people. So did the entomologists in Germany. But that really wasn't what happened. The daylight savings came about because during World War I, Germany had enacted a measure to save electricity. And we kind of liked that. So we started playing around with it. And then in 1918, Woodrow Wilson made it official. And then once Wilson had left, the Republican Congress had undid it, and then FDR brought it back again. Studies have been done. It shows that it doesn't really save any electricity. There are people who are the medical field, kind of the health stuff I like to report on. They're like, this is bad for the children. And this is, this causes health problems, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how much water or truth there is to all that, but it certainly isn't helpful. And if it isn't adding anything and it's just making things a little bit more confusing, it's a pain in the neck. I mean, why keep it around? Just get rid of the silly thing.
Okay. Kat, what about you? Of all the things going on in the world right now, it seems that at least there's bipartisan support on one thing.
Pick a time and stick to it. That's what I say. Folks have, there seems like there's a lot of controversy over whether we stick to daylight savings time or go the other way, but Americans as a whole want to stop changing our clocks. And there's a lot of good arguments to do so. One is that there's a 6% increase in traffic fatalities in the week following clock changes. And part of that is people are just really tired. There's all sorts of other negative impacts. We have increased strokes. We have increased heart attacks, even within hospitals. Once you get there, there's higher rates of medical mistakes that are made by doctors who, again, are too tired. And there's all sorts of things that it doesn't add up. We're supposedly doing this in order to save energy. And the studies that have been done either show no impact or that there's increased energy use. Meanwhile, I think Peter sort of alluded to this, but we have this national folklore about this being done to help the farmers. And then we say, well, okay, well, most Americans aren't farmers, but that's even not true. It was never to help the farmers. This was a marketing story. What actually happened was the oil and gas industry lobbied for it because they calculated and found out that Americans would be purchasing more energy. And that is the case. That's what we've seen happen as a result of daylight savings time. Over time, other industries, including the barbecue industry, who wanted people to be out barbecuing on summer nights, and
that sounds good to me.
Right? Yeah, it sounds great to me. Love it, but I don't think that they should be choosing the way that we set our clocks for everybody. Industries such as the American candy industry, who wanted children to have longer time to trick or treat on Halloween because it sells more candy. There's all of these different corporate interests that have decided that they're going to set our clocks and keep changing our clocks in a way that harms our health. And you know what? It's frustrating. It's confusing. I call my family in India all the time. They don't change their clocks. So it's always a little bit confusing to remember, okay, is the time there now this, or is it this? And I think that there's just so many reasons that we need to, again, pick a time and stick to it.
James, what about you? Are you going to be sad to see daylight savings time ending?
I have to say, this is an issue that doesn't rouse me in one way or another. I don't feel the effects of going on to daylight savings time or going off it. I do like the longer days in the summertime. I have to say that, but if they went away, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
Well, let's move on to our most underreported story of the week. And Kat, let me go to you first. What is your most underreported story of the week?
Well, you can always count on a feminist story from me. You probably know this part wasn't underreported, that equal pay day fell this week on Tuesday. However, what wasn't underreported is the actual story of what's happening. Because while there is a pay gap, a gender pay gap in the United States still, what's really interesting and what people don't talk about is with younger women, young women below the age of 30 who are not married and who don't have children, the gender pay gap actually reverses itself. In other words, they make more money on average than their male peers. So what we're actually seeing is it's those two things, getting married and having children, that then cause women to make less money, and those pay gaps reverse and start to grow into their 30s. Because what's happening here are there are cultural views about child rearing, and both that play out both in the fact that women still to this day, even in joint income families where they earn the same amount as their male partners, are doing significantly more child rearing. And the fact that within the workplace, we have unequal gender policies, whether it's people genuinely trying to help women by mommy tracking them and thinking, oh, okay, I'm not going to give her the harder positions because she's not going to do as well, where they oftentimes promote men who they think are now going to be working harder. Again, well-meaning people are doing this. And also, we still have a very large gap between maternity and paternity leave in this country. And so we actually need to make cultural changes around how we view families and childcare and child rearing to see a more equal gender pay gap, a more equal lack of gender pay gap, I should say.
Peter, I'll go to you next. What's your most underreported story of the week?
My most underreported story of the week is Ruan versus United States. It is one of two major cases being looked at the United States Supreme Court right now. And these are about doctors that prescribe too liberally prescription opioids to their patients. Ruan, I think, is accused of not seeing patients thoroughly, or sometimes it's not seeing them at all and prescribe. What's at issue in this case is that when the DEA and police go after doctors and they arrest them, they're not arresting them on any hard law. If you were to ask, okay, so what is too big of an opioid prescription for X disease or X illness? What's the number? When is it too much? It doesn't exist. You will not find that number at any major medical organization. You will not find it in law. And that's the major question being asked. And also, people like Alito have pointed out that there is a problem of intention. This is, what's the difference between a doctor that, this is a controversial debate. If you flip on the lower side, you say you should underdo it just in case, or you're on the wrong side of this argument now, well, then you could go to jail for 20 years. What the heck?
Very interesting. We'll go on to James. Last but not least, what is your most underreported story of the week, James?
Well, I have a literally much more far out story, to use a term from the 60s. And I have to look at this because it's so unbelievable, but there is some evidence, it's a new theory in physics, that our universe has a twin universe, and that this universe runs, speaking of daylight savings time, runs backwards in time, according to our notion of time. And this theory of this new theory of physics, which turns not only Newtonian physics on its head, but Einsteinian physics on its head, has arisen as yet another attempt to explain black matter. It seems like and I'm not going to begin to tell you what black matter is in our universe, other than it's some huge void that we don't understand what it is or how it came into being. But it seems like every 5 or 10 years, there's a new theory as to what black matter is, how it came into being, and where it's going. I think one theory is that it will eventually destroy our universe, which will get swallowed up into it. I'm not sure I'm right on that. But bottom line is, we may have a twin universe that runs in the opposite time as ours. So it's going back to the, I guess it's going back to the 15th century, back to the 13th century. I think there was an Oscar nominated, maybe even an Oscar winning movie made about that. Benjamin Button,
Oh, okay, yeah.
if anybody saw it. An infant who was born an old man and lived his life backwards. Or maybe the movie makers were ahead of their time.
Well, I certainly wouldn't be against going back to my 20s, but and I appreciate you ending on that very philosophical note, a lot of food for thought, and we'll end it there because that's all the time we have for this edition. And thanks to our wonderful guests, and thanks to all of you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. I'm Cecily Fernandez. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. We'll see you next time.